My name is Alice Riley. I was the first person hung in the state of Georgia. I did not kill my master, but I still paid the price for it. My only regret, losing my child in the process.
I figured there's no better way to begin this series than by digging into the history of Georgia's executions, starting with the earliest known case on record. Before lethal injections, before electric chairs, there was one primary method of execution: hanging. And Georgia's first recorded execution wasn't just an act of justice, it became legend, a ghost story whispered through the streets of Savannah. But for the woman at the center of it all, this wasn't folklore. This was her life, and this was her end. Alice Riley wasn't a mythical figure. She was a real girl, a teenager, whose final moments have been twisted into tales told on ghost tours and in darkened street corners. But beneath the hauntings and horror stories lies a deeper truth. A truth about justice, a truth about punishment, a truth about whether those in power truly seek fairness or simply retribution. And is it any surprise that the first person put to death in Georgia was a young woman? A girl who, by today's standards, might not even face execution at all. This was the early 1700s, a time not far removed from the Salem witch trials, when fear dictated fate. But Alice Riley wasn't a witch. There was no black magic here, just a tragic chain of events that led to the gallows. As a country, we've come a long way in the courtroom. We have juries, we have appeals, we hear both sides, and yet wrongful convictions still happen every day. Sentences don't always fit the crime. Justice remains flawed, so it begs the question, are we truly better than those who handed down verdicts hundreds of years ago? And that's what the final judgment is all about. We'll uncover the darkest corners of our justice system, from Georgia's first hanging to modern-day executions. We'll explore what it means to face death as punishment. How do you regain control of your life? One thing is certain, though. When your fate is sealed, there's no turning back. The gavel has fallen. This is Final Judgment. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. Georgia has a long history of sentencing individuals to death, with the guilty facing the ultimate consequence. And the state's first legal method of execution was hanging. Currently, 27 out of the 50 states still allow the death penalty, including right here in the Peach State. And before our current method, lethal injection, we had the barbaric electric chair, which, believe it or not, was still in use until October 2001, when the Georgia Supreme Court ruled executions by electrocution to be cruel and unusual punishment. Georgia has employed capital punishment since colonial times. Over the years, the crimes punishable by death in this state have included murder, robbery, and rape, but also horse stealing and even aiding a runaway slave. A grim reminder that justice, for much of history, has not always been just. There are also records of executions carried out by firing squads, and at least 2 people burned at the stake, a punishment that feels more medieval than American. Yet it happened, right here in Georgia. But before the electric chair, we had hangings, and hangings weren't just punishments. They were events. Much like the Romans watching gladiators fight to the death, communities gathered to witness the condemned take their final breath. It wasn't just about justice, it was about spectacle, a form of public theater where the price of admission was the thrill of seeing a life end. Crowds cheered, children watched. The guilty weren't just sentenced to die, they were put on display, ridiculed before the noose ever tightened. Their final moments were not solemn, but a spectacle of humiliation and horror. A last breath taken not in silence, but under the gauze or gaze of a crowd hungry for retribution. It makes you wonder, was justice really the goal, or was it actually something darker? Public hangings weren't meant to serve as a warning, a symbol of law and order, but in reality, they became a grotesque form of entertainment. In a cruel twist of irony, it mirrors the dystopian horror of the Hunger Games, where children are forced to perform for an audience, all while knowing their deaths are inevitable. Just as tributes are sacrificed for the illusion of control and order, so too were those who met their fate on the gallows, their suffering repackaged as a lesson for the masses. Public hangings were the legal method of execution in Georgia from 1735 until as late as the early 1900s, 1924 to be exact. And that's barely 100 years ago, if you think about it. That's not ancient history. That's within reach. A time when death was still a spectacle carried out in town squares for all to see. Executions weren't hidden behind prison walls or carried out in sterile, cold rooms. The sheriff of the county or the judicial circuit where the crime was committed was responsible for carrying out the sentence. Justice wasn't just served, it was performed. The condemned stood before their community facing not only death, but judgment in its rawest, most public form. The first person on the record to be legally executed in the state of Georgia was a young colonial woman in 1735. A name you might recognize if you're familiar with state history or if you're drawn to a good old ghost story. Her name is forever tied to one of Savannah's most infamous landmarks, Wright Square, also known as the Hanging Square, a place where countless lives were taken in the 18th century. A name synonymous with the deaths of many, those accused and sentenced to death in that very spot. It was here, at this chilling crossroads of justice, that they would meet their final fate. But among the many lives lost, there's one story that stands out, not only in Savannah's history, but in Georgia's as well. This is the story of Alice Riley. It's 1733. General James Oglethorpe and over 100 other passengers arrived on the shores of the Savannah River. Oglethorpe, who was a British aristocrat, sought a fresh start for himself and his people, an escape from the religious persecution they faced in England. He dreamed of a place where freedom was more than a concept, freedom to practice their own religion, to live how they chose, without the looming fear of prosecution. And what we call the land of the free, they would find sanctuary. Settling in what would become the state of Georgia, Oglethorpe and his settlers claimed the land as the 13th colony, America's final addition after New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and of course, South Carolina as well. The colony was named Georgia in honor of King George II of England, and Savannah would become the first city of this new venture. The relocation to Georgia wasn't just about starting over. It was about strengthening the colonies through trade and prosperity. Savannah would become America's first planned city, designed by the general himself to be a hub of order and commerce. Its layout included wide streets and shady public squares, town meeting places that doubled as centers of business. Savannah originally boasted 24 squares, 22 of which remain today, each one steeped in history and a quiet reminder of the city's founding. And among the people on those ships eager for the fresh start promised by the New World was a young colonial woman named Alice Riley. Alice was an indentured servant from Ireland. One of nearly 40 Irish servants had embarked on this journey, fleeing a life of hardship and starvation back home. They were dreamers, driven by the hope of something better, a new life in a land full of opportunity. They were ready to leave behind the despair of their past, excited about the possibilities that awaited them across the sea. And not just for themselves, but for their children and the generations that would follow. Alice's story is shrouded in mystery, with much of her past left to speculation. We don't know what horrors she faced in Ireland or what drove her to seek refuge here in the New World, but we do know she did escape the Irish famine in 1733. The hardships of her homeland, marked by famine, oppression, and a life of despair, could have been the very catalyst that pushed her to risk everything for the promise of a better future. She dreamt of a life free from persecution, a place where she could build something new, perhaps a life she could control and shape for herself. But what Alice couldn't have anticipated was the harsh reality that awaited her here in Georgia. Far from the fresh life she envisioned, she found herself bound to the cruel whims of a tyrannical slave owner, trapped in a life of abuse and suffering. The very escape she sought, which had once promised hope, soon would become a nightmare. a place where her dreams of freedom and happiness were violently crushed. And what's tragic in Alice's story is that she never truly found the life that she had hoped for. Instead, she became a symbol of the painful truth that freedom, especially for those in her position, came at a steep and irreversible price. Alice O'Reilly arrived in Savannah months before she became an alleged murderer. Desperate to leave her homeland, she had indentured herself as a servant to return for passage to the colonies, passage to the free world. And by the time the ship finally reached the shores of Savannah, many of the Irish servants had perished from starvation or illness during the long, treacherous voyage. For those who did survive, though, the promise of a new life awaited, but that hope would soon be replaced by a very real nightmare. A nightmare they had thought they left behind in the old world. The dream of a fresh start would quickly fade, and what was supposed to be a new beginning would turn into a tragic story. A story that would haunt us, and one that we would never forget. No one knows Alice's exact age, but we do know that she was young, still a girl by today's standards, likely no older than 17. Folklore suggests she may have even been as young as 14 or 15. In today's world, we would consider that far too young to fully grasp the weight of her actions. But this was colonial times where life and justice operated by very different rules. Alice and her fellow indentured servants arrived in Savannah in January of 1734. Alongside her was her common-law husband, Richard White. Alice had agreed to work for about 5 to 7 years to pay off all her debt and earn her freedom. A deal she accepted with the hope that someday she would be able to escape the cruel conditions of her servitude. Alice knew her life as an enslaved woman wasn't going to be easy. She knew she would have to make the best of it, enduring the harsh realities of a world that saw her as nothing more than property. Yet, despite the constant struggles, the hope of freedom always lingered in the back of her mind, fueling her desire to one day break free from the chains that bound her. But the promise of freedom and Alice's dreams of a better life would be crushed when she found herself under the ownership of a cruel, devilish man, William Wise. She had expected hardship, but she never anticipated being placed in the care of a man as vile and abusive as him. Along with her lover, Richard, Alice was assigned to work as an indentured servant for William, a cattle farmer whose reputation for cruelty would soon become a nightmare for both of them. Records describe William as a man who was unanimously unlikable, rude, untrustworthy, and definitely prone to anger. William's reputation was so bad that he had originally been denied passage to the New World. He was rumored to be involved in prostitution, which, even in those times, was considered unlawful. William even allegedly brought the prostitute with him to the new land, passing her off as his daughter. Despite this, he managed to make his own way across the ocean, arriving in Savannah. Rather than punishing him and sending him back to England, General Oglethorpe decided to have him live and work apart from the main town, isolated on a cattle farm. He was exiled to the other side of the Savannah River on Hutchinson Island, north of downtown where most of the town had settled. And at first, everything seemed normal. Alice and Richard were at William's beck and call, serving him on his farm. In those days, servants like Alice and Richard were not seen as people, but as property, tools to be used at the mercy of their masters. They were in the New World, yes, their situation was far from ideal, but they still had the promise of a new life. A life free from the fear of persecution. They could dream, they could hope, or so they thought. Under Wise's oppressive rule, Alice and Richard were subjected to unimaginable torment. The dream of freedom seemed further and further out of reach as they endured the abuse that William inflicted upon them. Months after settling in, however, William's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He became bedridden, and it was Alice and Richard who were tasked with caring for the increasingly unlikable cattle farmer. You might expect that in his time of need, William would show some appreciation for the care that he was receiving, but the reality was far different. Reports suggest that he remained as angry as ever, and his rage seemed to find its target in Alice in particular. Whether it was because he viewed his servants as little more than property, or whether he harbored a particular disdain for women, it's unclear. But Alice bore the brunt of his cruelty. William made her life a living hell. And his abuse wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and sexual too. Alice had no rights. To him, she wasn't even a person. She was just an object to be controlled, mistreated, and degraded. Ultimately, Richard and Alice reached their breaking point. They had endured enough of William's abuse. This wasn't the new world they had envisioned. It was the same cruelty they had escaped in Europe. They realized they had to take matters into their own hands if they ever really wanted to truly be free, to start a life on their own terms. But they couldn't just leave. William would come after them. They feared what he would do if he knew their plans. They knew then that, in order to live peacefully, they had to eliminate the source of their misery, William. Alice and Richard allegedly devised a plan. They would kill William. He was so despised that no one would care about his death, or so they thought. With his health deteriorating rapidly, they figured they can make it look like he died of illness, or at least like an accident. Then they would take what they could: food, valuables, necessities, anything that would help them survive as they fled. They planned to disappear, never to be found again. Alice was forced to bathe her master daily, a task that was both physically exhausting and emotionally tormenting. But she saw this as an opportunity, one she knew could be her moment for revenge. She knew that during the daily ritual of washing his hair, William would tilt his head backwards, his neck would be exposed and vulnerable. It was the perfect time for her to act. Alice realized she could easily force his head down into the water and hold it there, drowning him. In her mind, it was the only way to ensure that he would never again torment her. This moment, this opportunity, would be the one time she could take control. One time when she could act without fear of retaliation. Whether it was out of desperation, anger, or the need for justice, Alice made the decision. This was the only way to break free from her nightmare. And as the water rose around William's neck, Alice knew this would be the end. Whether or not they intended William's death to be an accident is unclear. Alice was young, and it's likely she didn't consider the full consequences of her actions. After enduring so much abuse at his hands, it's reasonable to assume that she maybe didn't even care. Perhaps for one fleeting moment, she wanted William to suffer the same way he had made her suffer. The details surrounding William Wise's death have been a source of debate ever since that fateful day. One version of the story suggests that he was found in his home, his head submerged in a large bucket of water with his neckerchief tightly tied around his throat, seemingly staged to look like an accident. In this version, Alice and Richard managed to make it look like he had died from his declining health or perhaps from an unfortunate mishap. Other accounts, however, tell a different tale. Some say that Alice and Richard didn't bother with hiding the body in the house, but instead took their master's lifeless form and dumped him in the Savannah River. And it wasn't until days later that his body would wash up on the opposite shore, a grim discovery that would eventually lead authorities to search for the perpetrators of this brutal act. Despite the conflicting stories, one fact remains clear. William Wise's death marked the beginning of something much larger. It would go down in history as the colony's first murder case, and more notably, as the first recorded murder right here in the state of Georgia. Alice and Richard's actions would set the stage for a dark chapter in the state's history, and the consequences they would face would echo through time. The couple fled immediately, hoping to get far enough before anyone discovered William's body. But whether they underestimated the search for William or simply didn't get far enough, no one really knows. Alice didn't just take the life of her master, she became a murderer. And in doing so, she lost her own chance at redemption in this new world. Her desire to escape the cycles of abuse and suffering led her down a dark path, one that would cost her the very freedom she had sought. What is certain is that they didn't venture too far from the farm. Instead, they sought refuge on Isle of Hope, a small island about 8 miles from Savannah, which is now part of the Savannah metropolitan area. It was there, hiding in plain sight, that Alice and Richard were eventually found. They were captured and soon after sentenced to death for the murder of William Wise. And despite the fact that forensic evidence was non-existent at the time, both Alice and Richard maintained their innocence. But in the end, their pleas fell on deaf ears. It didn't matter. While awaiting execution, Richard, Alice's lover and accomplice, allegedly managed to escape from prison. His freedom, however, was very short-lived. He was soon captured by two brothers who found him attempting to flee. Richard pleaded for his life as he was swiftly taken to the gallows, desperately claiming his innocence and denying any involvement in William's murder. Alice's story took yet another unexpected twist when it was discovered that she was pregnant. This revelation would delay her execution. At the time, the law prohibited the execution of pregnant women. In a society that often viewed women as property, this rare instance of mercy based on her pregnancy highlighted the complex relationship between gender, morality, and law in colonial times. It's never been confirmed who the father of Alice's unborn child actually was, and to this day, it remains a subject of speculation. Evidence could point to either Richard, her lover and partner, or her master, William. Richard was with Alice, and the two did flee together. However, some believe that William could have been the father as well, possibly through rape. Alice's conditions under William's care were horrific, and sexual abuse could very well have been part of the torment that she endured. We know that William engaged in prostitution and falsely claimed women as his daughters, which had initially led to his isolation in the first place, so no one would be surprised if he got Alice pregnant. But we may never know who fathered Alice's child. The details remain lost to history shadows, leaving only the tragic fate of Alice herself. A woman once full of hope for a new life now found herself trapped in the cruel grip of justice. Her dreams, like so many others, had been shattered. Though Alice was given a brief reprieve due to her pregnancy, it was fleeting. Even the hope for a future for her child seemed cruelly out of reach. She was caught in a limbo, awaiting her end. Alice remained imprisoned until she gave birth, and her baby was taken away shortly thereafter. Eventually, Alice's execution proceeded. Despite the brief relief, the law would be carried out. And on January 19, 1735, Alice was hung in Wright Square, located on Bull Street between West State Street and West York Street, now a landmark of Savannah. She became the first woman executed in Georgia, and her body was left dangling for 3 days as a public reminder of the law's unforgiving reach. In a tale that echoes the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, Alice's lover, Richard, was reportedly hung on the very same gallows the day after Alice met her untimely fate. Their love, though brief and marred by violence, was sealed in the afterlife as they both faced the very same grim end. Her execution starkly reminded all who witnessed it that even in this new country that promised hope and religious freedom, no one could escape the law, no matter the circumstances, no matter the evidence. And just like Richard, Alice maintained her innocence until the very end, repeatedly professing that she was not guilty. And to this day, Alice's legacy serves as both a reminder of Georgia's early legal system and the trials and tribulations that shaped the judicial framework we have today. Her story has transcended time, continuing to be passed down through generations. Whether recounted in history class or shared on a local ghost tour, Alice's tale remains embedded in the fabric of Georgia's history. Her name is forever linked to the state, her fate a poignant reminder of the injustices of her time and the complex history that led to the evolution of law and justice in America. And not only is her name etched in Georgia's history, but many claim to see Alice's ghost, dressed in period garb, her spirit haunting Wright Square to this day. Some believe Alice is searching for her newborn child, torn from her arms so soon after birth. Others think she's seeking vengeance for her unjust execution, a punishment she never accepted. There are those who speculate that she is reliving the horrors of the abuse she endured daily at the hands of her cruel master, William Wise. Locals and tourists alike have reported eerie encounters, with some saying that they have come face to face with Alice herself. It is said that she enjoys making herself known, especially to mothers with babies and strollers. Some believe Alice's connection to motherhood and her stolen child is what draws her spirit to these families. But whatever the reason, Alice's restless spirit lingers in the very same place where her life and her hope were tragically cut short. Her presence continues to captivate those who visit the square to this day, a reminder that some spirits cannot rest, still fighting for the justice they never received in life. Years later, a letter written to the general at the time by Edward Jenkins, an early settler in Savannah, would resurface, recounting the tragic events that led to Alice's final moments. In his letter, Edward recounts Alice's actions and what led up to her facing death. The woman was hanged yesterday and denied the murder of Wise. The most she had to answer for was her wicked confession of a thing she was not guilty of, by which means she imagined was the death of White. She seemed to be of the same principle as White was. Another letter written by Thomas Christie reveals an even darker part of Alice's legacy. Alice Riley was hanged some months ago, within 6 weeks after she was brought to bed, pursuant in her sentence on the 11th day of May last, and the child is since dead. These letters not only shed light on the events surrounding Alice's trial and execution, but also add a layer of mystery and sorrow to the story. Alice's tragic end left a mark on Georgia's history, and her legacy continues to provoke questions about justice, guilt, and the human cost of a life lived in the shadows of hardship and abuse. It is believed that Alice's son, named James, died weeks after her own tragic execution. The loss of her child adds another layer of sorrow to the already heart-wrenching story. The death of her infant so soon after Alice's execution highlights the brutal and unfair circumstances surrounding her life and legacy, leaving her story one of unrelenting grief and misfortune. Not only do many still believe that Alice's ghost still haunts Wright Square to this day, but it is said that while she was professing her innocence on the gallows, Alice allegedly cursed the city for not believing her. A curse that many still think lingers, haunting the streets of Savannah to this very day. Many people have different theories about Alice's curse on Savannah, but it is believed that Spanish moss will not grow on the trees in Wright Square. While the moss blankets much of the park for reasons unknown, whether it's due to a ghostly legend or just nature's very own inexplicable rules, Spanish moss refuses to grow on the northern end of the park, the very spot where the gallows once stood. This eerie occurrence has fueled the legend that Alice's curse still lingers in the area, her spirit somehow influencing the growth of the moss, or perhaps preventing it from flourishing as a form of revenge or even sorrow. It could simply be folklore or an embellishment to the tragic legend, but many have claimed that Alice's ghost has appeared to more people than any other ghost in the United States. Whether there is any truth to that claim is uncertain, but what remains undeniable is that Alice's legacy has become a haunting part of Savannah's and Georgia's history. Whether it's the lingering presence of a wronged woman seeking justice, or the tragic echo of an unjust fate, Alice's Riley story continues to be woven into the fabric of the city's and state's past. The whispers of her spirit serve as a chilling reminder of a history that, for some, may never be fully laid to rest. Alice Riley's death serves as a poignant symbol of how the early judicial practices in Georgia were deeply influenced by power dynamics, inequality, and social standing. The parallels between her time and today's judicial system are striking and unsettling. In Alice's case, of lack of a fair trial, reliance on hearsay, and her status as an enslaved woman played a significant role in her tragic fate. The system, which favored those with power, like landowners, wealthy citizens, and those in higher social positions, ultimately condemned Alice in a way that mirrored the ways that those with resources or status today can influence outcomes in criminal cases. And in the 18th century, the absence of a jury trial and reliance on gossip and biased testimony meant that people like Alice, particularly enslaved individuals and women, were at the mercy of a system that didn't offer them a fair chance. And similarly today, while the system has evolved, inequalities persist. Whether it's a highly paid legal team, media influence, or the political connections of the accused, those with privilege can often avoid the full weight of justice, just as Alice's accusers may have had more power than she ever did. Meanwhile, countless individuals, often from marginalized backgrounds, are wrongly convicted or face extreme punishments such as death row based on insufficient evidence or systematic biases. This duality highlights the ongoing issue in our justice system. The punishment doesn't always match the crime, and the innocent sometimes pay the price while the guilty walk free. Alice's death by hanging in such an unjust and hurried manner mirrors the death sentences handed down to people today, whether on death row for crimes they may not have committed or for crimes with little more evidence than the mere accusation of a person who has been unjustly targeted. The very nature of Alice's case, her claim of innocence, the possibility that someone else might have been guilty, the abuse she suffered at the hands of her master, and the uncertainties surrounding her actions brings into question the integrity of the legal process, then and now. Today, the concept of innocence until proven guilty should stand, but the reality is that countless people, particularly from marginalized communities, face an uphill battle to prove their innocence or even get a fair trial. Alice's tragic fate is a reminder that while society may like to think it has moved beyond the barbaric practices of the past, the core issues of power, control, and injustice continue to affect our criminal justice system to this day. Racial, gender, and class inequalities still permeate the system, and people are still wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, and unjustly punished. The story of Alice Riley may have occurred centuries ago, but its echoes still reverberate in Georgia's judicial history, and unfortunately, in the judicial systems of today. The final judgment has been made, but Alice's legacy is far from over.